This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to risk analyst Alex Kokcharov. He is from Belarus. He focuses on Belarus as well as Ukraine, Russia, some other places. And he's going to be speaking to us about the clashes happening right now in Belarus, where it looks very much like the dictator, let's not mince our words, the dictator Lukashenko has rigged the election. It looks very much like that has happened, and the protesters, the people have come out onto the street and are absolutely sick of it. They've been met with a very harsh crackdown. Security forces have been beating them. One protester has been killed. There has been live rounds. There has been a military scene. It's all going mad right now. So Alex is going to explain to us what is happening. If you like what we're doing, please do consider supporting us at patreon.com/popularfront. Before we get into the current events, maybe you can give us a little kind of brief history of the situation in Belarus. And, you know, Lukashenko has been in power since 1994. Maybe you can just go over that, because a lot of people actually have not really any clue where Belarus is or what it is. So for a lot of people, this has kind of come as a shock. Like, where is this place and why is it going mad, you know?
So Belarus became independent from the Soviet Union in 1991. When the USSR disintegrated, and actually the agreement on the dissolution of the Soviet Union was signed physically in Belarus, in the Belovezha National Park, the Belovezha Accords of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So in 1991, it became independent, and for the first couple of years of its independence, it was trying to build a transition towards a more democratic society and political system. And in 1994, a new constitution was adopted, which included a position of president. Positions of president were very popular in the former Soviet space. It was believed that having a strong leader was important for success. So a lot of countries of the Soviet Union adopted presidential systems or mixed presidential parliamentary systems. And in 1994, there was a first election in Belarus, which was free and fair, and in which President Lukashenko was elected. So he was genuinely elected by the majority of the electorate, because in the second round, he ran against quite an unpopular prime minister who was an apparatchik, and so it was a very easy win for him. And Lukashenko ran an anti-corruption campaign. He was promising to reduce corruption, improve living standards, bring back many of the things from the recent Soviet past, improve relations with Russia. And it resonated with a lot of people. So he was elected genuinely in a free and democratic vote. But very quickly after becoming president, he started working towards building more power around himself. And in 1996, the constitution was amended through a very rigged referendum. And his powers as president were significantly expanded. There have been multiple presidential elections since, and the latest one took place on 9th of August 2020. And in that election, Lukashenko was claimed to be re-elected. The preliminary count by the Central Electoral Commission said that he received 80.1% of the vote, which, based on the evidence we saw from the exit polls, independent exit polls, and also from the voting in the polling stations at Belarusian diplomatic missions abroad, which generally had very little electoral anomalies, is probably unlikely. So he probably, it's quite unlikely that he would have received more than 80% of the vote. Yeah. So that's kind of the brief introduction to what's been happening in Belarus.
Right, and what kind of a leader has he been? I mean, I know for a while he was very close to Russia, and then they kind of fell out. And certainly people I know from Belarus have all told me, like, this guy is a straight-out dictator. It's a very... Up until recently, you know, people would call it, oh, the last dictatorship of Europe, but I don't think that's quite accurate anymore. I think there are a few more. But yeah, like, what kind of leader was he?
Well, he's clearly, an authoritarian leader. He built a system of the so-called vertical of power, where he has a very centralized political system where he's at the very center of all decision making. And he is in charge of all appointments from the level of mayors to regional governors to ministers and everyone else. So he controls everything in the country. Belarus is a relatively small country, population of 9.6 million. So it's, similar population to London. And Lukashenko ran it as a collective farm. He used to be a collective farm director back in the day in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. So the system is very centralized. He did start building bridges with Russia, and he adopted a policy of political and economic integration with Russia in the 1990s. But I believe that it was driven not by his interest in Russia or his ideological beliefs, but rather on his expectations that in any united state of Russia and Belarus, back in the 1990s, young and energetic Lukashenko would do very well compared to the old and ailing Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president at the time. Lukashenko was quite popular in Russia among significant parts of the population there for a period of time. And I think this reintegration project, which he started in mid-1990s, was primarily driven by his desire to become fundamentally the leader of Russia or of the united Russia-Belarus Union and to sit in the Kremlin. Everything has changed when Vladimir Putin became Russian president in 2000, and they have had a complex relationship since. But overall, over the past 26 years, Belarus benefited significantly by the economic relation it has had with Russia, particularly through subsidized energy supplies for a very long period of time. This has changed recently, and it has had an impact on situation in Belarus. But until recently, Belarus was fundamentally subsidized by Russia via supplies of very cheap energy resources such as natural gas and oil.
Right. Okay, so they kind of relied on them. Is that why he keeps kind of referring to them as their big brother?
Yes, and Lukashenko plays this game very carefully. There have been several incidents of falling out between him and the Russian leadership, and the latest episode probably started around 2014, 2015, when Russia got involved in Ukraine and Crimea and Donbass have happened. And this type of development obviously created fears in Belarus that, what if Belarus is next? So Lukashenko adopted a policy of rebalancing his foreign policy relations. He tried to rebuild some bridges with the West. He released political prisoners. And by doing so, many of the Western sanctions have been removed, including by the European Union and the United States. And he's been, he's been playing this game of maneuvering between Russia, the European Union, United States, and also increasingly China. He has been, a Russian ally in certain aspects, but not 100% committed on other aspects. So, for instance, Russia and Belarus have multiple economic and political and military alliances, but Belarus is still ambiguous on its position over Crimea, for instance, whether it recognizes it as part of Ukraine or as part of Russia. And in any theoretical military conflicts between Russia and Ukraine over Crimea, Belarus is under Lukashenko would likely be quite ambiguous about whether to support its former military ally, Russia, or actually try to be neutral, as Lukashenko has been trying to do. If you remember, since 2014, negotiations on Donbas peace resolution have been taking place in Minsk.
I guess that's quite a hard game for him to play, because if he says Crimea belongs to Russia, then that opens him up for places in his country to get taken.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so it's a very fine line for Lukashenko to thread, and he's been quite successful, because he's been trying to maneuver between various centers of power. And for instance, despite the fact that Russia and Belarus are formally in multiple economic and political alliances, they have engaged in trade conflicts over multiple types of tradable goods, from oil and gas to sugar and milk and dairy and meat, and you name it. And in the most recent incident of trade disputes over oil pricing, for instance, the United States came to rescue, and with the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo actually visited Belarus, and then U.S. crude being delivered to Belarus at the time when Russia suspended its deliveries to Belarus. So Lukashenko has been quite masterful in exploiting these big confrontations between bigger powers in the region and globally, in order to benefit his own position.
Right. So let's look at these elections then. So the elections were on Sunday. It was the 9th. Why were these such a big deal this time around? I've seen protests before they even started, like weeks before, and it seemed like the people weren't, I don't know, looking at it, it was like the people are no longer as scared as they were to kind of, fight back against the government. We saw people attacking police as they were, beating protesters even before. So why was this one such a big deal?
So this election, we have to remember that it's been 26 years now that Lukashenko has been president. So basically you have an entire generation of people who were born while he was in power. And, they are already young adults, and they can vote, they can, they have the rights, and they feel that they don't, because, they have had the same person on top of the political system for a very long time. And for the first time in the recent history of election, there was a genuine candidate who was representing, the society at large, and who was running on a ticket of bringing back democracy to Belarus. She was very open about her interest to have only a very brief political career. And I think it's appealed to a lot of people who saw someone who's been there for 26 years. She said that if elected, once she's elected, she would release all political prisoners, and about 700 people have been detained before the election. She would hold a referendum on bringing back the Constitution of 1994 with much more reduced powers of the president and many more checks and balances in political system, where the parliament would be able to keep the president in check. And she would, within 6 months, hold a new democratic, free and fair election in which all independent candidates, alternative candidates to the previous candidate, could run. And then she would step down. So she was basically running on a platform to be a temporary interim president who would oversee transition from an authoritarian system in which you don't really have options to a more free one, where people, including politicians might emerge who would offer a different vision for the future of Belarus, and she would let people decide, who that person is.
So it was like for the first time in a long time, they had like a genuinely kind of democratic opposition.
For the first time, there was a genuinely democratic candidate who was interestingly not part of the established opposition. A problem with Belarusian opposition, it often is confined to kind of a very ghettoized space. It's either identity politics, so for instance, the sort of national conservative opposition, which is focused on preservation of the language, the culture, at the time of strong dominance of Russian language and Russian culture, and also there is the opposition on ideological lines, which is based either on ideas of social democracy or communism or Christian democracy. So all of these traditional opposition parties have actually very limited appeal to the wider electorate. And having this candidate this year, who was not part of this established opposition, who was not limited to political views of a very specific political interest group, whether on identity politics or ideological politics, but who was focused on democracy, was a first, really, for a very long time. And this is what mobilized people, and I think this is what brought so much attention to her and made a lot of Belarusians think that there is an option, there is an actual option of bringing some change bringing some change to Belarus and to do it peacefully.
Right, and where did she come from? Like her background, she seems to have been a bit of a I don't know. Like it seems like very rare that would have come out of such a place.
Yes, she is absolutely remarkable because 3 months ago nobody knew her name. Her name is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and she is the wife of prominent YouTube blogger Sergei Tikhanovsky, who is quite well known in Belarus. And he actually announced in May that he would run for presidency. But he was initially detained for a short period of time. And the logic of the authorities was that while he was in detention, he would not be able to file his application to the Central Election Commission. And of course he couldn't, because he was behind bars. So what she did, she filed a petition herself. And so she became this unexpected and accidental candidate, I would say. And initially she was quite reluctant to run. On 29th of May, her husband was arrested again, and he's been behind bars ever since. I don't think he will be released anytime soon. And so she decided to run despite, the threats against her, partly because she believed that it was a way to help her husband and to have him released, if she would be elected. And I saw her early interviews. She was quite disoriented and shy. She never had any political experience. She worked as a teacher of English, and she worked as a translator, and then she's been housewife in the recent years, focusing on bringing up her 2 children. And now she was catapulted into the spotlight of national politics, and she became a candidate. And interestingly, by mid-July, she was registered as an official candidate. And I think it was a massive miscalculation by the authorities, because they just didn't expect that a housewife with no political experience, and I think also an important element here is that she was a woman. She was not seen as a threat. Lukashenko made several statements that women were not fit to take office of president, that the constitution required a man to hold this very heavy burden of being the head of state. And it's actually offended a lot of Belarusian women. We have to remember that in Belarus, 55% of voters are female. And a lot of them were very disappointed by what they've heard, because, why a woman cannot run for president, why she cannot be president. So in the end, she started her campaign. She joined forces with the campaigns of two other presidential hopefuls who were not registered. One of them is former banker Viktor Babaryka, who was detained in mid-June on financial fraud, tax evasion charges. And again, he's been in prison, in detention ever since. And another one is former diplomat Valeria Tsapkala, who was also not registered. But she joined forces with their campaigns, and by uniting the forces, they've established quite a significant, powerhouse, which was headed by three women: Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, so the presidential candidate, but also Veronika Tsapkala, who is the wife of the non-registered candidate Valery Tsapkala, and Maria Kolesnikova, who was the head of the campaign of the banker Viktor Babaryka. And these three women became this unexpected feminist twist in the political life of Belarus, and they've mobilized a lot of support. And I think because this campaign had this very strong female participation, it was one of the reasons why it was so successful. And wherever they would go, they would be receiving rock star treatments, and they would mobilize very large campaign rallies. Campaign rally in Minsk was estimated at up to 70,000 people, which is unprecedented by Minsk standards. And rallies in regional cities were up to 20,000-30,000, which is again very large crowds by Belarusian standards. And it was very unusual campaign she ran.
Right, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but from what I've observed over the last few months, Belarus seems to be quite a progressive place. Like, culturally, the people seem to be quite progressive, considering where it is in Europe. I mean, let's be honest, in Eastern Europe and them areas, there's quite a lot of, like, hard right-wing nationalism, a lot of fascism there. But from what I've observed, people seem to be kind of not on that so much. I've even seen, like, anti-fascist football hooligans fighting the police. I mean, would you say that's a part of it, or have I completely misjudged that?
I think Belarus is generally quite a tolerant country, and this is largely due to the fact that it's very homogeneous. It doesn't have significant minorities, whether ethnic or racial, and it has a very long history of cohabitation of different religious groups. While a lot of people think that Belarusians are Russian Eastern Orthodox, many are actually Roman Catholics or Protestants, or Greek Catholics. So it's a very mixed place in terms of kind of religious setup, which I think adds to the tolerance of the society. And for instance, if you travel to Belarus, you often come to a city or a town, and you would see a Roman Catholic church and an Eastern Orthodox church on the same square. And until World War II, obviously there was also a synagogue. But because of the Holocaust, the Jewish population was decimated in the 1940s, and then it further shrank in the 1980s and 90s when Soviet and post-Soviet Jews were allowed to migrate to Israel or the United States. But it has this history of mutual tolerance and respect, and extreme ideas are not particularly popular in Belarus, whether on the extreme right or extreme left. So Belarusians are, I would say, politically very much in the center.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's talk then about the election. So it comes to the election day, everybody's out there. Within about 3 hours, I started seeing videos where it looked very clearly like there was some rigging going on. There are people climbing out of windows, like with ladders, with allegedly having like votes stuffed into boxes and stuff. Tell us about that. What happened on election day on Sunday?
I think what's important is actually not just what happened on the election day, but what happened in the 5 days prior to that.
Sure.
Because in Belarus, there is a procedure called early voting, which started on Tuesday. So for 5 days, there was formally early voting. And according to the official data, 43% of the entire electorate voted during this early voting, which is unprecedentedly high, but even by Belarusian standards, it's much higher than in the elections of 2015 and 2010. And this early voting, when there are no observers, is often used for vote rigging, because that's the perfect time to stuff some ballots into the boxes. So, the day of voting comes and it transpires that, nearly half of the population already voted. And what did the election commissions did? They, on the day of the actual election on Sunday, they restricted the numbers of people who were allowed into the polling stations, and they claimed that it was done for the sake of, health, because of the coronavirus pandemic. And they restricted the number of polling booths, significantly, cutting down the numbers of people who can vote at the same time. So on the streets of Minsk and other cities, there have been very large, very long queues of people waiting for hours to be able to vote. And many couldn't, because polling stations closed at 8 o'clock in the evening, and not everyone could vote. It was even worse at diplomatic missions of Belarus. So, for instance, in London, the embassy here, which normally fits about 4 or 5 booths during the election, it only had 1 booth, which means that they were only letting 20 people per hour into the building to vote. And with some 600 people turning up to vote on Sunday the 9th, a very large proportion of these people were unable to vote here in London, for instance.
Right, so it started taking place straight away. I mean, even beforehand.
So the rigging started taking place even before. And then towards the end of after the polling stations closed in Belarus, the government-owned television channels started announcing results of the government conducted exit poll, which claimed that Lukashenko won about 70% of the vote. As many people in Belarus, especially among younger urban voters, have voted for his opponent, for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, they just couldn't believe that this was a genuine result. And that's the reason why people decided to come out to protest on the night of the election.
Right. So as soon as the elections come in, the election results came in, it seemed like people immediately mobilized, right?
Yes, a lot of people started coming out to the streets, and we've seen protests in Minsk and many other cities and towns across the country, because people could not believe what they've heard. They could not believe that Lukashenko could win, especially by this large margin. If the authorities would have claimed he won by 53%, maybe people would not be so disappointed with what they've heard. But because the claim was so high, and actually on the next day, the Central Election Commission claimed that he won more than 80% of the vote, which is even more improbable. So the protest started taking place, and police immediately started using force which was not seen before in the history of Belarusian protests. In the past, police, of course, would use force to disperse and detain protesters, but they would normally use batons and shockers, electroshockers, but they wouldn't use anything heavier than that. But on the first night of protest, on Sunday night, the police started using water cannons, stun grenades, rubber bullets, tear gas, which was unprecedented by Belarusian standards. And on the second night of protest, they started using live ammunition in one incident in Brest, in southwestern Belarus. And also first fatality during protests in Minsk was confirmed. So, it took just literally 2 nights for the police, a forceful response, to escalate to the use of live ammunition and to causing fatalities, which is unprecedented by Belarusian standards.
And I think something else which seemed unprecedented to me, at least from the eye I've kept on Belarus, was the way that the protesters were coming out. Like, there were barricades, we even saw Molotovs, like, obviously in response to the brutality from the police. But it seemed like now the protesters are they're just not scared anymore. It seemed to me that, like, something is, I don't know, the camel's back has been broken, if you like.
I'm not so convinced that this is the case. I think there is still a lot of room for further escalation of brutality by the security services and the police. But what we're seeing an attempt of protesters to move towards more non-violent methods of protest, where for the government it's much more difficult to morally justify use of heavy force. Because, it's one thing, when you have these protests happening at night and barricades, and the government can claim, these are riots. People are throwing objects at us. But it's completely different when the protests are taking place not in the evening, not at night, but during daytime, and protesters are clearly unarmed and they're carrying flowers. So it makes it much more difficult for the government to find pretext to use heavy force against such protesters, because they don't look threatening, and there is a lot of evidence showing that they're not threatening. What has been happening in the recent days, yesterday and today, there have been several female-only protests, which is one of the ways to by the protesters to reduce the likely use of force by the authorities, because they would think that the authorities are not going to send heavily armed riot police and start, throwing stun grenades at groups which are made only of women.
Yeah, you would hope not.
Yeah, you would. Yeah. Actually, last night there was less violence, for instance, on streets of Minsk than the previous nights.
Right, but the government has also started nabbing people, right? I've seen a few videos where they're jumping out of cars, they're shooting out people's tires, and they've done this weird thing where they're parading protesters on state television, right? They've got them cuffed up. There's videos of them just beating people on the ground. Like, do you think then that is maybe why the protests have been a bit quieter?
Well, I think it's several reasons. So first, the fact that authorities are using heavy force, and they're willing to show that they're using heavy force, and the fact that there have been a lot of detentions over the first 3 nights. About 7,000 people have been detained. About 250 have been hospitalized with injuries. There have been 2 confirmed fatalities, and I would suspect that these numbers will grow as we simply find out more. And it's obviously reduces the willingness of people to come out and protest. But also because, there was this change in tactic of protesters, making it more difficult for the police to use these violent methods and tactics of detaining and dispersing protesters. So, for instance, initially on the first night, protesters tried to congregate in more central locations. But in the past 2 nights, they move to the periphery of the city, where it's much more easier for them to disassemble if the riot police arrives, and just run away to their respective homes. And then, once the police is gone, to come back and protest again. So the tactic is changing, and it makes more challenging for the police to control the situation. It overstretches its capabilities. What we've seen, people were blocking roads, fundamentally preventing police from arriving at locations of protest, because police need to go by roads, and if roads are blocked, what can you do? And so there is a change in tactic, and I think in the coming days or weeks, if these types of protests continue, they will significantly overstretch the ability of police to control those protests and to keep them in check.
Right. And we've been seeing this kind of, like you were saying, this escalation where it's riot police and then there's live rounds. But we're also seeing what's called the KGB Alpha units. Maybe you can explain to us, what are they? We know that, people have said to me, it's not the KGB anymore, it's the FSB. I'm like, yes, I know, but Belarus still calls it that. Like, what are they? Who is the KGB Alpha that we're seeing on the streets?
So they are actually KGB, because Belarus is the only country of the former Soviet Union which didn't even bother renaming the KGB. So it's still KGB in Belarus.
Yeah.
And the Alpha, they are specially trained specially trained officers with fundamentally military-style training, who are trained to deal with situations of this sort, to work during protests and riots, and to prevent violent overthrow and of the government. So the fact that they're being deployed on the streets suggests that the government understands the risks from the protests, and the government wants to keep the protests in check in order to make sure that they do not present a challenge to government stability.
Right, and they're trained, they're quite close with Russia still, right?
Well, overall, Belarusian military and security services are still very linked to Russia. Both countries are military allies. A lot of senior Belarusian military officers, but also officers in the security services, have training in Russia. They went to Russian military universities, military colleges. They've done training in Russia. They often train with Russia during joint exercises. So there are still a lot of ties to Russia between the military, the security services, and to a lesser extent with the police. The police is less linked to Russia, but security services and military still are.
So what do you make about these videos then, where I've seen, I think, 7 now, where I don't know if it's former military, but at least they still have their fatigues and their badges and their berets. It's like Belarus military people videoing themselves saying, I'm no longer associated with this, I'm throwing it away, because they're disgusted by what the people are doing, what they're doing to the people that are protesting. Do you think that's kind of something quite big, or is it, maybe just for show?
I think it's indicative that, some people are unhappy with the direction which the current government is taking, and they do not agree with the fact that such heavy methods are used by the police and by the security services to detain and disperse peaceful, unarmed protesters. But based on those videos, I've seen also a bunch of videos, but I think there may have been about 10 or 15 of those police officers or special forces officers. And for instance, if you look at the numbers, the police force alone in Belarus is 87,000 people. With the KGB, including Alpha, it's about 100,000 people. So if we have even 100 of those defecting and resigning from their service, it doesn't change the game. The majority would still keep their loyalty with the government. But on the other hand, if, in the coming days or weeks, we're going to be seeing thousands of them leaving their offices and resigning, then it would show that, loyalties are no longer there. So I think, it's important to remember that the numbers are still quite low. And at this rate, even if 100 or 200 of 100,000 people in the security services and the police resign, it doesn't really change much on the ground. Majority of the police and security services are still loyal to the government.
Okay. And hypothetically now, there's a lot of people that are saying to me, oh, is there going to be a Maidan like in Ukraine? And honestly, I don't really see the comparisons at all, to be honest. Like, I get it, but I just, no, I don't think so. But, like, if something like that were to happen, what do you think Russia's response would be?
Russia was one of the first countries, was actually second country, which congratulated Lukashenko on Monday with his victory. So I think it indicates that the Kremlin still supports him as the president of Belarus. I think he's preferred candidate for the Kremlin. And the main reason is that, he's also an authoritarian ruler, the same as Putin. And authoritarian regimes tend to like each other. They find it easier to work with each other, despite all the differences and disagreements they might have had in the past or might have in the future. They find it easier to work between each other. Transition to democracy would open too many unknowns for Russia. So I think their tactic is probably to deal with Lukashenko. He might be, he might be not the preferred ideal candidate, but he's probably better out of those which are there. So I think Russia will support him politically, and potentially even, if he requests help of the Russian security forces or military, also by deploying such forces if he asks for such help. I think he will try to avoid asking for such help because he knows that it will weaken him in the future in any relations with Russia. And especially if Russian military comes into Belarus to deal with the protests, it will be much more difficult to ask them to leave after they're no longer needed.
Yeah, as we all know, when Russia turn up to, ostensibly protect the Russian-speaking peoples, they don't ever go back once that has been done.
Yes, that's correct. So I think he would try to avoid such a situation, but if situation becomes critical, I think he would potentially ask Russia for help, and under the circumstances, Russia would be likely to send such help.
Right. Well, this makes me kind of confused though, because he has that kind of relationship, but then I think a few weeks before the elections, there was this strange story where alleged Wagner mercenaries from Russia were all arrested by the KGB Alpha in Belarus. What was going on there?
To be honest, I don't think it was a genuine event. I think it was a staged spectacle, which probably had multiple reasons for it to be carried out. And it was probably done with tacit support of Russia. So Russia probably knew about what was about to happen and probably agreed to play along. There was not much of a significant criticism in Russia of the fact that Russian citizens have been arrested.
Yeah, I saw that.
So kind of because Russian response was quite muted, I would say Russia was probably part of this spectacle, which was probably aimed to demonstrate that Lukashenko is the supporter of Belarusian sovereignty and independence, and that if voters don't vote for him, some green men are coming and are going to destabilize Belarus, and it's going to be another Donbass. I don't think that many Belarusian voters bought this theory, but probably it was something along the thinking was probably along the lines. I don't think it was a genuine event, which was that they were like that these people were presenting any genuine threats to Belarusian government or something like that.
Right, which is kind of ironic because actually now that he has stolen the election and things are getting heavy, like if it got worse, then you would actually see the Green Men coming in, but probably with his help. It's a weird situation. Is there any specific kind of region in Belarus that identifies as Russian? Like for example, we had that in the Donbass even before the kind of the Russians went in and basically seized the place. There was actually a lot of people there that identified as Russian. You have a similar thing in like Narva in Estonia. Is there any place in Belarus like that?
No, Belarus is quite homogeneous. It's mostly ethnic Belarusian, and it's mostly Russian-speaking, especially urban populations. In Belarusian cities, you would very rarely hear Belarusian spoken on the streets. So, those pretexts which were used in Ukraine by Russia to interfere in 2014 would not work in Belarus because there are no areas with ethnic Russian population, and there are no areas with Russian-speaking population because Russian speakers live all over, and they basically live in all cities, and they're clearly not, they're not discriminated. And if you ask me, Belarusian speakers are actually much more discriminated in Belarus than Russian speakers. So I don't think that Donbass scenario is likely in Belarus, and any attempts to create a Vitebsk or Homel People's Republic would they wouldn't have any potential substance on the ground to support such attempts.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up, because I was wondering. I was like, oh no, they're going to pull that trick. Your job is basically to analyze this situation, and it's your home country, so obviously this is very close to you. What do you think might happen in the next kind of few weeks? Do you think this is going to play out well, or do you think it's going to be more of the same, just violence and aggression?
Well, I think the fact that Lukashenko announced that he is the winner of the election, it indicates his intent to stay in power in Belarus for the time being. I think it's more likely than not that the use of the repressive state apparatus, including police and security forces, will eventually subdue the protests, and Lukashenko will stay in power, but it will weaken him. It will weaken him both domestically and internationally, because on the domestic front, he no longer will be able to claim that he has support of the people, and he will become in a position of, a foreign occupying power in his own land, and it will be very difficult to actually carry out successful policy, because I can easily see that he will be traveling somewhere and he will be booed by people, and it's unpleasant, of course. So I think most likely he will remain in power for now, but it will weaken him domestically, but also internationally, because what we're seeing is there are calls for sanctions in many Western countries against Belarus. This includes European Union, this includes UK, United States. A lot of politicians, including in the European Parliament, in the US Congress, are calling for new sanctions against Lukashenko government. With what's happening in Belarus, it's quite likely that such sanctions will be introduced. And it will make Lukashenko weaker, because he no longer will be able to play this game of foreign policy rebalancing, and he would be stuck with Russia. He will be in a situation of this, unpopular kid who can only hang out with other unpopular kids.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it. But a lot of those unpopular kids that you can hang around with have a lot of power still, though, no?
Yes, but Russia is much more powerful unpopular kid, and in the situation Belarus vis-a-vis Russia, Lukashenko will be in much more weakened position, and Russia would be able to ask for various concessions from him for continued support, and this might include, for instance, privatization of key economic assets in Belarus, such as major industrial plants, their privatization and their sale to Russian companies. Also, Russia might ask for military bases in Belarus. It has asked for those in the past, and Lukashenko managed to rebuff such Russian designs back in 2015. But back then, he was much stronger domestically. And now it will be, he will be much weaker. So he will be doing whatever Russia wants. So if it happens, basically, he will end up in a situation of hollow victory, Pyrrhic victory, where he's in power, but he's weakened, and his ability to conduct both domestic and foreign policies is very much limited.
Right, and remind me, which countries does Belarus border?
So Belarus borders on Russia. It's the longest border. It also borders on Ukraine, and it borders on 3 EU states: Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia.
So that would be a dream for Putin to get Russian bases in Belarus, right?
Yes, because they from bases in Belarus, he would be able to threaten both Ukraine and also NATO.
Yeah, that's not a great situation, but I guess, then he could say, well, NATO's built bases around me, blah, blah. Alex, is there anything else you think we should cover before we wrap this up?
Well, I still think that obviously there is an alternative scenario where Lukashenko's regime will crumble. I still think it's less likely than Lukashenko continuing, at least for the time being. Maybe not necessarily for the full term, not full 5 years, but at least for now. But I think if there is significant increase in non-violent protest in the form of strikes, which affect major sectors, including manufacturing sectors and public transportation sectors, which fundamentally paralyze the country, that could start cracking the elites up. And if the elites start disintegrating and people who are in power start defecting and resigning from their positions, that would indicate that Lukashenko is weakened domestically and he would be pushed towards an exit. But I still think that this scenario is less likely than the kind of main scenario of Lukashenko using heavy hands to remain in power.
Right, that's something I forgot actually. Yeah, well, there's a big strike today, right? And it looks to me that it's nationwide. The
strikes are spreading. They're still, relatively small by the national scale, but they're already taking place in multiple industrial factories in Minsk and in other cities. But they haven't affected the transportation system as of yet. And they haven't caused, because they're in the early stages, they only started, they haven't caused significant economic impact. But if they continue for an extended period of time, and they remain peaceful and non-violent, it will put this, pressure on the system, and particularly on the economic system, the economic functioning of the system, where Lukashenko would no longer be able to boast that, he is presiding over stability, because stability will no longer be there. So if the strikes can continue for weeks or maybe even months, that could be potential scenario under which he will be pushed out. But it remains to be seen whether this scenario will play out.
Yeah, well, let's hope things will get better for the people. Mate, where can people find your work and follow you on social media and what have you?
Well, I'm on Twitter, Alex Kokcharov in one word. So I'm on Twitter and I focus on the region. So a lot of content on Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and currently more in Belarus because it's much more eventful right now. But I'm sure Russia and Ukraine can be eventful in the month and years ahead as well.
Yeah, man. I mean, spell your surname for us, for anyone that doesn't clock that.
Okay, absolutely. So it's Alex Kokcharov, Kokcharov.
Thank you very much, mate. That was really insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that was Alex Kokcharov speaking about the uprising, the clashes, the stolen election in Belarus. It's all ongoing right now. The strikes have got a lot bigger. We're seeing people by what some are saying maybe tens of thousands out on the street now. Specifically today or yesterday, depending on, well, what day is it? Oh, fuck. Well, it doesn't matter. By the time you hear this, last week, there was one of the protesters that got killed. He was shot at point blank range by the Belarusian security forces. There was like basically kind of a makeshift public funeral for this guy. So the clashes are very much still ongoing, and it seems to be getting bigger and bigger. The metro workers have gone on strike as well in Minsk, so that's obviously a big problem for the regime there, for Lukashenko. When metros are not running, it's actually causing some serious harm to his power. As usual, if you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us at patreon.com/Popular Front. That is the main way we make money, the main way we can keep doing this, the main way we do our documentaries, podcast episodes, everything. We are anti-corporate. We do not accept corporate money. God knows we would probably be in a better position financially if we did right now, but that's not what we're about. So yeah, patreon.com/Popular Front. Or popularfront.co/support. Or if you want to look cool, wear our merch and support us at the same time, go to popularfront.shop. This episode is sponsored by Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're a good bunch of guys and women, an independent coffee shop selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 Southwest Bond Avenue 97239. This episode is also sponsored by Grindcore House, a pair of independent coffee shops in Philadelphia, USA, one in South and one in West. Check them out on social medias at Grindcore House, and you will see them where you can get coffee. Tell them Popular Front sent you. The episode is also sponsored by Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and informing people about historical conflict propaganda. Get prints at propagandopolis.com. I'm in the process of working out a 10% off code for Popular Front listeners. So maybe wait another week or two before I've got that. But yeah, check them out, propagandopolis.com. And as usual, like I said, please support us at patreon.com/Popular Front. You get bonus episodes, access to the community Discord. There's nearly 500 people in there now, all with various different skill sets in research and all sorts of stuff like that. It's a very interesting place to be. Every person you can think of. There are goths, there are trans people, there are gay people, there are white people, black people, Indian, Brazilian, Arabs, Kurds. Everyone is in there basically. There is no bullshit. Yeah, there's a good bunch of people in there. So patreon.com/Popular Front, all sorts of benefits, all sorts of extras, and it keeps us moving forward. Social media, follow me at Twitter at twitter.com/Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN. Popular Front is at Popular Front CO. The Instagram is instagram.com/popular.front. And on YouTube, we've got a brand new documentary up there showing the rise and fall of the Seattle CHOP protest. YouTube.com/Popular Front. And very soon, we will have a documentary, a small, short kind of dispatch, if you like, from the ground in Belarus, showing what it's like, the protests up close. We've had our lad Luke Pierce, he's been filming there. He's out now, so we can talk about it. We couldn't really, because obviously it's a brutal dictatorship there, and people have been getting absolutely battered. A lot of journalists have been arrested now as well as of this recording. Most of them, luckily, they're kind of getting deported straight away rather than kept, but still it's a bad situation. A lot of protesters been tortured, beaten. Again, one has been killed. It's just awful. So yeah, we got a documentary coming to youtube.com/Popular Front soon, all about that. It's great work. Follow Luke at Luke Pierce 1 or Luke Pierce 100. It's on Twitter, it's one or the other, and on Instagram it's one or the other, but have a look. Have a look. Thank you to the following people from the Patreon. They are, if this graph will fucking load, K. Hardy Roberts, Alexander, Nicholas Butter, Ron Swanson, JD, Jav, Bastian Gamillo Rittmeyer. Sorry, I'm a bit ill today. Ian Froese, James Cully, Michael Akakan, Ethan Reyes, Fitz Madrid, Joe Watt, Alex Northrop, Ed Coulthard, Johnny LaFleur, Clayton Taylor, Hugo Newski, Maxwell Burke, Anthony Kabarik, Michael Barone, Don Wayne, Scott Hopton, Liam Williams, Fragile Feeling, Chris Cusimano, you put my teeth back in today, Sebastian from the Discord, Degenerate Zero Alpha, DR, Trey Nance, Charlie, Olin Thorne, Amy Rupert, Rubicon, Azad, Frank Austin, Amelia Mee, Christina Ravetti, Moody Al-Rashid, Bill Wilson, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Brian McLaughlin, Ari from the Discord, Young Wasabi, Sarushe Hawazi, Tony Bin, Adam Bergsnyder, Scartoon Music, Stephen Davila, Patrick Bronte, Dan Dunham, Fletcher Tate, Chad Walker, Diana Gorvanek, Q-Ball, Lawrence Abrahams, Peter McCormick from What Bitcoin Did, Emily Molly, Axel Iverson, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Joanne Stocker. Thank you all so much for helping this move forward. This is, not gonna survive without the support of the people on the Patreon, especially the high tier people. Thank you all so much, really appreciate that. And yeah, like I said, if you want to get involved, patreon.com/popularfront. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home and the outro was by Sam Black. Notice, see if you can notice the sample he's used. Check him out at samblackpf.com.